Hey guys, so we're continuing on with Unit 7. This will be the last video in Unit 7, the last bit of notes, covering our last movement. We've gone through gay liberation, the Chicano movement, the Native American movement, the Red Power movement, and today we're going to be talking about the Asian American movement. Now, there's no secret that we know that Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the United States have a long history of experiencing pretty difficult discrimination. When we started to get the first big wave of Asian immigrants back in the like mid to late 1800s on the California coast, with gold mining and railroad construction, we immediately saw an intense hate form towards these people. And California and other states on the west that saw a large amount of immigrants coming in from the Pacific, they started passing laws to discriminate against them. They tried to strip them of their citizenship. They segregated their schools. We know the federal government eventually started to severely restrict, virtually prohibit Chinese immigration with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. From there, we know that in the 20th century, it still hasn't been a cakewalk. During World War II, we saw a lot of hate and blame put on Japanese Americans, and most people, like just regular, ignorant, especially white people, don't, differentiate between different ethnic groups within Asian Americans. And this is very different from like the Chicano movement, which is like specifically Mexican American, or similar movements. The Asian, I mean, that's a continent, and so there's a lot of different groups wrapped up in this who all have their own differences and things like that as well. I mean, it's not just Chinese people in this. It's Vietnamese, it's Cambodian, it's Laotian, it's Japanese, it's everyone in between. So and we'll see I'll come back to how that is going to play into it in a minute. But in World War II, we know that the Japanese got a lot of hate, and I'm sure other Asian groups did as well, from people who don't know the difference between a Chinese person or a Japanese person. But President Roosevelt signed an executive order during World War II to send people of Japanese heritage who are living in the West Coast region to internment camps, and that will last for a majority of America's involvement in the war. And at this time, there still hadn't really been, but by the time we're getting to the 60s and 70s, there hadn't really been a huge moment of oh, those internment camps were a terrible decision and a civil rights violation and all of these other things. We hadn't really had that aha moment yet. But more people were beginning to. But at the same time, we were already at this, while we were dealing with the aftermath of that, we're in the midst of an entirely new issue, which is the Vietnam War. And we'll see tons of, especially when the war ends, tons of Vietnamese immigrants coming to the United States to escape the communist rule that was taking over there. And there will be a lot of discrimination, blame for the war, blame for debt, blame for loss of American lives. So it's obvious why there would need to be a movement among this particular group. They were experiencing the same problems that these other groups were experiencing in cities. Lack of funding to their schools, lack of inclusion in, higher education curriculum in terms of their histories, police brutality, low income, low job availability. All of these things are the same things that the inner city civil rights movement was working towards, same things the Chicano movement was working towards, and same things the Red Power movement was working towards. So the largest organization, and the organization to kind of kick all of this off for the Asian American movement, is called the Asian American Political Alliance. This was formed in 1968 by two students at UC Berkeley I think I've mentioned before, but if not, I'll say it again. Berkeley will really become a center for like a hotbed of protest and student movement and social change. That's definitely one of the big, I guess, legacies that UC Berkeley has had, and one of the things that they're certainly known for is student activism. And these two students, Emma Gee and Yuji Ichoika, which is Yuji, and then last name is Ichoika. And Emma Gee is just Gee, her last name. So these two uh, were members of other groups. They were members of, women's lib groups, and they were members of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And they started to realize, like, all these other groups have, activist organizations, and we don't have that. And we need that just as much as anyone does. So Emma went through the student directory. I don't even know if they still make oh yeah, all student directories now are just online. They don't make printed student directories anymore. But when you're in college, you can look up any student at your school online and get their email address. I don't think you can get more than that, but you can get their name and email address. But she went through her hard copy student directory and picked out anyone who had an Asian sounding last name and sent them a letter and basically saying, you might be Asian. We think you are. If you're not, ignore this, or don't ignore this. But if you are, and you feel like that there's a real group that is speaking to your experience, even though you've been, passionate in helping others achieve their equality, come to our meeting. And so they had tons of people show up to that first meeting, and it just continued to evolve from there. It was really intended to be similar to SNCC in the civil rights movement. It was intended to be that grassroots movement led by students, but not only students involved. The Asian American Political Alliance reflects a lot of the overall trends that we see in the general Asian American movement. They had a very pan-Asian focus, which means they are trying to encompass all Asian groups, not just one particular racial group, but all of them. And we'll see the Asian American movement as a whole, but definitely the AAPA really heavily influenced by the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement. You can see that photo up there at the top with the guys in their black berets. This is California. This is where the Black Panthers were founded and were starting to gain a lot of traction at the time. And there were Asian members of the Black Panthers as allies, and vice versa. Those two groups really link up closely with each other. And one of the things that the AAPA wanted to talk about was a situation, one particular thing that they experienced that most other racial groups having their activist moment have not been experiencing, is something called the model minority myth. Like I said, all of these groups are fighting for similar things, not just like voting, but whether it be, like I said, more funding to schools, inclusion in curriculum, jobs programs, vocational training, healthcare, things like that. There is, the model minority myth is definitely unique to Asian Americans, and no other racial group really has, or immigrant group has really experienced that, what that means is that they are the model minority. The idea that, that some of the discrimination and the microaggressions that Asian Americans experience are like, well, you're so smart. Oh, you must be good at math, or things like that. And a lot of people who don't understand the weight of microaggressions or racist vocabulary in general, or stereotypes, they don't get the weight of that. And about comments like that, they think like, oh, it's a compliment. Like I'm saying you're smart. Like, why would you be mad about that? That's not racist. Yes, it is racist. If you're making any type of judgment about a person based on the color of their skin, it is racist. So that was a conversation that they'll start having that's certainly unique to this movement. Now they will sort of merge, or not merge, but they will work very closely with a similar movement called the Third World Liberation Front, which was sort of like a branch of the Asian American movement, but it's not just going to be Asian Americans who participate. It was definitely more inclusive, but Asian Americans had the largest presence in the Third World Liberation Front. So this was also founded in 1968 at UC Berkeley, same year as the AAPA. And it's essentially a bunch of third world country movements working together. A bunch of immigrants and people whose heritage is from third world countries, like all, creating this sort of united front. They will organize, the Third World Liberation Front will organize the longest student strikes in history. Not the largest. The largest, those were strikes against the Vietnam War put on by SDS. But the longest student strikes in American history were put on by the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State and at UC Berkeley. Their demands were they wanted more minority faculty, they wanted inclusion of minority studies, they wanted more ghetto student admission, meaning they wanted students in really low income areas to get more of an opportunity to be admitted to college. They wanted work studies for minorities, meaning so that they could, get a job, but also focus on school at the same time, and they wanted more financial aid across the board. They were successful actually at both schools. And both schools, due to these protests, will create a Department of Ethnic Studies, and they will single-handedly create ethnic studies as a course and major. And to this day, every major college and university in the country has an ethnic or global studies department and several courses, and all of that comes back here. It started here with the Third World Liberation Front in 1968, which is pretty cool.